Hello, this is Father Mark, and it is day 72 of the Bible in a Year, and we are hearing and reading Book of Numbers, chapter 24 and 25, and Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26. And in 24 of the Book of Numbers, we have the conclusion of the story of Balaam. And Balaam says here that it says that he was looking for omens. He had been looking for omens, and that phrase means looking for opportunities to curse Israel. He's kind of searching and trying to see if he can see any omens or bad omens for Israel, but he can't find any. He can't see any, and so instead he lifts up his eyes and says the Spirit of the God came upon him. So in verse 2, and so now, God is going to use this man who's kind of a psychic or a visionary or a sorcerer, but he's going to use him for good. He's going to give him some true oracles. And so he looks out at these tents and he says these very famous words, very famous, beautiful. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel. And what does that mean? Well, does it mean that their tents were really nice tents, really cool? They were very elaborate. But it's not like they were kind of like from a fancy camping store like REI or some expensive camping outfit. But no, it meant that they were orderly. As we know, the tribes were all encamped in an orderly way around the tent of meeting in the center, and it was a beautiful thing, a beautiful society. And so then Balak says some prophecies and prophesies a king in verse 7. His king shall be higher than Agag. And it's speaking of a king, and in fact a king who's going to have dominion over a number of different countries and such. Like a lion, it says in verse 9. And we know that it was only later, because at this point, God was their king. God didn't want them to have a king just yet. But here we have this prophecy that he's looking to the future and seeing that these people are going to have a king, and like a lion. And we know that the prophecy to Judah, when Jacob was dying, he blessed all of his sons, and he blessed one of his sons, Judah, and said that he will be like a lion's whelp. He will be a king and have a scepter. And so sure enough, here's another prophecy of that's going to happen. And then in verse 17, in this final oracle, he says these famous, famous words, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob. Now, a star was often in ancient times a symbol of a king, of a rising king. Because, astronomers or astrologists back then was kind of the same thing. People who tried to see the future or try to know what's the gods are thinking by looking at the stars and the changes and the planets changing. And so if they saw something rising, they thought it was a star rising, and they would think of that as a king. And for the Israelites, their Messiah, their Davidic king, had the symbol of a star. And so the Star of David became the symbol of the whole dynasty of King David and all of his descendants. Then it uses the word scepter also. A star shall come forth, a scepter shall rise. And a scepter is a symbol of a staff that the king would hold. And then it goes on to mention all these countries or areas that would be crushed and conquered by this future king. And so it's a prophecy of a monarchy, that they would have a monarchy and a king and an empire, basically a multinational kingdom that they would conquer other nations around. And they sure did. At the time of King David and King Solomon, it was the height of the Israelite empire, basically. We've heard of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. Well, there was also Israel, the Empire of Israel, conquered quite a bit of the area of all the way out to Babylon and down into Egypt and such. In chapter 25, we have another apostasy of the Israelites. And here they are in the plains of Moab, about to enter the promised land, and Balaam is kind of blessing them up on the hill, and at the same time they're down there, just kind of like Moses up on the mountain, and the Israelites in the meantime were worshiping a golden calf, and they were getting up afterwards, and after eating and drinking, and then play. They began to play, which meant kind of an orgy. And so here it says the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. And these Moabite women were inviting them to take part in their pagan rituals and and orgies and such. And they led them astray. And so then there was a plague, and there was punishment, and they were supposed to hang them in the sun, which kind of like being crucified. That would someone be tied for some time under the sun. It was kind of in the hot desert. It was a punishment, and so we have these punishments. Then we have the story of Phineas there in verse 7. It says that he was the one who found this couple having relations, actually, sexual sin right there in the tabernacle tent, which of course is a great blasphemy and desecrating the holy space. And so the punishment there was that he immediately speared them both. And so this was Eleazar was praised and given a promise to that he, and it's very similar to the fact that the Levites executed the punishment on Mount Sinai. Here it was Eleazar, who was also a son of Aaron the priest. And so it's parallel in many ways to what happened on Mount Sinai with the golden calf incident. This is kind of a parallel event, very similar with a lot of the same elements. Mentioning a plague, mentioning the fact that a certain number of people stood up for what is right and executed the punishment that Moses would command, or the Lord would command, and they became blessed and became a covenant of perpetual priesthood for them because they were jealous. He was jealous for his God. Phineas was praised there in verse number 13. So in a certain sense, I guess a priest or a bishop or a clergyman is kind of a Levite, sort of supposed to be zealous and kind of fighting the Lord's fight against evil, against the devil. And all of this kind of reminds me of something I learned from, courses on exorcism, that exorcists know that if there's a desecration of a church, like if someone does some sort of satanic ritual or some sort of evil act in the church or on the altar in the church, it has to be reconsecrated. The church has to be rededicated, and has to, there's certain prayers that have to be done. And that is because the sanctuary is holy. It's a sacred place, and it is makes a sin even worse. It makes a blasphemy if a serious sin is done within the sanctuary. In chapter 26 of the book of Deuteronomy, we have, as Father Schmitz said, this beautiful image of the fact that they had to, when they first come into the land of Israel, they'd have to offer first fruits, offer some of the fruit of the land, and this was later. It also became an annual offering, but this was just a one-time thing. When they first got into the Promised Land, they were going to offer, some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, and they were to come forward. And it's just like at Mass. It says in verse 4, this is lovely. It says, "The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar." That's just like what we do at Mass, isn't it? And but the person who brings up the gifts at Mass doesn't have to speak. But here they have a speaking part. The person had to say this little speech. "A wandering Aramaean was my father," and that was Jacob, because Jacob's mother Rebecca had been an Aramaean, and so we have this poem, which kind of this speech, which is a summary of all the good things that God had done for them. At the end of chapter 26, there's a sort of a promise that God and Israel make to one another in verses 16 through 19. And that promise is raised to the level of a covenant in the next chapter, verses 11 through 26, when it's kind of restated with consequences, with punishments if they weren't faithful. And so that's why you've got at the very end of it, again, chapter 27, verse 26, it says, "And all the people said amen." And then it became not just a promise, but a covenant.